The envelope was cream-colored and heavy, the kind that felt expensive between your fingers. When it arrived on that Tuesday afternoon, tucked between the electric bill and a grocery store flyer, it seemed completely out of place in the small mailbox of the apartment building. Her hand shook slightly as she opened it. Not from excitement, but from something closer to disbelief. Inside was an invitation, printed on thick cardstock with elegant gold lettering. The Riverside Country Club was hosting their annual charity gala in 10 days, and they needed a pianist. Their original performer had canceled due to a family emergency. And somehow, through a friend of a friend who remembered her from years ago, they'd found her name. She read it 3 times. Standing right there in the cramped hallway that always smelled faintly of cooking oil and old carpet, the pay wasn't much, barely enough to cover a month of groceries. But that wasn't what made her heart pound against her ribs. It was the word performer. She hadn't been called that in almost 20 years. At 42 years old, she'd gotten used to being called other things. A piano teacher, mostly. Sometimes just the music lady by the kids who showed up for lessons twice a week. Their parents hoping to check off musical education from their list of things good parents should provide. She was patient with these children, even the ones who clearly didn't want to be there, whose fingers stumbled over the same simple scales week after week. Her own apartment was small. Just 2 rooms and a kitchen you could barely turn around in. The upright piano took up most of the living space, its wood scratched and worn from decades of use. It wasn't a bad instrument, but it wasn't the kind of piano she'd once dreamed of playing. Those dreams had involved concert halls with velvet seats and perfect acoustics. Grand pianos that cost more than most people's houses. Audiences who came specifically to hear music rather than children, dragged along by their parents. But dreams have a way of fading when life gets in the way. Her father had gotten sick during her last year of high school, just months before she was supposed to leave for music school. The acceptance letter to one of the best conservatories in the country had arrived on the same day as his diagnosis. She'd made her choice without really thinking about it, because what else could she do? Family came first. Always by the time he recovered. 3 years had passed. The scholarship was gone. The opportunity had closed. She'd gotten a job teaching at a local music school, telling herself it was temporary, that she'd save money and apply again. But temporary had turned into 5 years, then 10, then 15. Somewhere along the way, she'd stopped thinking of herself as someone who performed. She'd become someone who taught others to perform, which wasn't quite the same thing. That week before the gala, something shifted inside her. She started practicing in a way she hadn't in years. Not the simple pieces she taught to students, but real music. Challenging music. She pulled out old sheet music she'd kept in a box under her bed. Pages yellowed and creased from being played so. Many times back when her fingers were younger and more confident, the neighbors complained about the noise. The man upstairs banged on his floor, which was her ceiling. At 11 o'clock one night, when she was deep into a particularly difficult passage, she barely heard him. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she was completely absorbed in the music. Her fingers hurt. Her back ached from hunching over the keys. But she felt alive in a way she'd forgotten was possible. She chose her repertoire carefully. Nothing too ambitious. Nothing that would expose how rusty her technique had become. Chopin, because his nocturnes were beautiful but forgiving. Debussy, because his flowing melodies could hide small mistakes. Beethoven, but only the pieces she knew so well, she could play them in her sleep. Safe choices. Professional choices. The kind of music that would blend into the background of a fancy party without drawing too much attention. On the night of the event, she spent an hour getting ready in her small bathroom, trying on the 3 dresses she owned that might be appropriate. None of them felt right. They were all too old, too worn, too obviously from discount stores. But she chose the black one, because black was classic. And classic meant invisible, and invisible felt safe. The country club was 20 minutes outside the city. In a neighborhood where houses had circular driveways and 3-car garages. She'd looked it up online, scrolling through photos of manicured lawns and tennis courts. Feeling the gap between her world and this one grow wider with each image. Her old car made strange rattling sounds as she pulled into the parking lot, surrounded by vehicles that cost more than she'd earned in the past 5 years combined. The ballroom took her breath away. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings so high they seemed to touch the sky. Round tables covered in white silk tablecloths filled the space, each one decorated with flower arrangements that probably cost more than her monthly rent. The walls were cream and gold, and everything gleamed under the soft lighting. And there, on a raised platform at the far end of the room, sat the most beautiful piano she'd ever seen in person. A concert grand, its black surface so perfectly polished it reflected the chandeliers above like a mirror. She approached it slowly, almost reverently. Her cheap shoes silent on the thick carpet, she'd arrived early, as instructed. The guests wouldn't arrive for another 30 minutes. She sat on the bench and lifted the keyboard cover, and just the feel of those keys under her fingers made her want to cry. This was a real instrument, the kind she'd only played a handful of times in her life. During college auditions and competitions that felt like they'd happened to a different person, she played a few scales to warm up, and the sound that came out was rich and full and perfect. The acoustics in the room were incredible. Every note rang clear and true, hanging in the air before fading into silence. For just a moment, alone in that grand ballroom with that magnificent instrument, she let herself imagine that this was her life, that she played in rooms like this every night, that her talent had been enough. Then the guests started arriving, and she became invisible again. They swept past her in their evening gowns and tailored suits, smelling of expensive perfume and wine. They laughed and greeted each other with kisses on both cheeks, their voices bouncing off the high ceiling. She began to play her prepared pieces, and not one person looked in her direction. She was background music. Sophisticated wallpaper, no different than the flower arrangements or the gold-trimmed china. She played Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, one of the most beautiful pieces ever written, and the room continued its buzz of conversation as if she wasn't there at all. By the end of the first hour, she felt herself becoming smaller and smaller, shrinking into the piano bench. Just another person going through the motions of a life that had somehow become much smaller than she'd once imagined it could be. But something was about to change. She just didn't know it yet. The first hour passed in a blur of notes that nobody heard. She moved from one piece to another, her fingers finding the familiar patterns almost automatically. Chopin melted into Debussy, Debussy into Beethoven. Each composition was technically perfect, every note exactly where it should be. But there was no soul in it. She could feel the emptiness of her own playing. It's like reading words off a page without understanding what they meant. The guests continued their conversations, their voices rising and falling like waves. Champagne glasses clinked. Laughter erupted from different corners of the room. A woman in a red dress that probably cost more than her car walked past the piano without even glancing in her direction. A man in a tuxedo actually set his drink down on the edge of the piano, leaving a wet ring on the polished wood before someone handed him a napkin. She was furniture. Expensive, well-maintained furniture that happened to make pleasant sounds. For furniture nonetheless. During a brief break, she stood up to stretch her legs and back. The organizers had set up a small table with water and snacks for the staff. Tucked away in a corner where the guests wouldn't see it, she poured herself a glass of water, her hands still tingling from an hour of playing. And that's when she heard them. Two women stood at a nearby table, their backs to her. They wore matching pearl necklaces and had the kind of hair that looked effortlessly perfect, but probably required an hour and a professional stylist to achieve. Their voices carried clearly in her direction. "The music is fine, I suppose," the first woman said, picking at her salad with a fork. "Nothing special, but adequate." The second woman agreed. "A bit uninspired, don't you think? Last year's pianist had more, what's the word? Passion. This one sounds like she's playing elevator music." They both laughed, that polite, tinkling laugh that wealthy women seem to practice, and moved on to discussing someone's recent divorce. They had no idea she was standing 10 feet away, hearing every word. Why would they? She was invisible to them. Just the help. She set down her water glass carefully, afraid that if she moved too quickly, something inside her might shatter. The words shouldn't have hurt. They were probably right. She had been playing it safe, keeping everything smooth and forgettable. But hearing it said out loud, hearing herself dismissed so casually, felt like a slap. She walked to the restroom on unsteady legs, pushing through the heavy door into the bright, fluorescent lighting that was such a stark contrast to the soft amber glow of the ballroom. The bathroom was as fancy as everything else, all marble and gold fixtures, the little bottles of expensive hand lotion lined up by the sink. She looked at herself in the mirror, really looked, maybe for the first time in years. The woman staring back at her had tired eyes and lines around her mouth from smiling patiently at students who didn't care about music. Her dress was pressed and clean, but obviously cheap. Her hair was neat, but nothing special. She looked exactly like what she was, someone who had settled, someone who had let life happen to her instead of making it happen. But underneath that tired face, she could still see traces of the girl she used to be, the girl who had won every competition she entered, the girl who had made her piano teacher cry with the beauty of her playing, the girl who had received a full scholarship to study music, who had been told by everyone who heard her play that she had something special, something rare. Where had that girl gone? She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. When she opened them again, something had shifted. A decision had been made, though she couldn't have said exactly when or how. She was done being background music. Done being invisible. Done playing it safe. In a small folder in her bag, she kept sheets of music that she'd never shown anyone. Pieces she'd written herself over the years, late at night when she couldn't sleep. When the weight of all those deferred dreams pressed down on her chest, and the only way to breathe is to let the music out through her fingers. She'd been writing music since she was 16, pouring everything she couldn't say out loud into notes and rhythms and melodies. She'd never performed any of it. Never even told anyone it existed. What was the point? She was just a piano teacher in a small music school. Who would want to hear original compositions from someone like her? But standing in that fancy bathroom, her reflection staring back at her with something that might have been courage or might have been desperation, she made a choice. She would play her own music. The piece she'd been working on for the past 3 years. The one that contained everything she'd felt and lost and hoped for. The one that scared her because it was so personal, so raw, that playing it would be like opening up her chest and showing everyone her heart. She walked back to the piano. With her folder clutched in her hands, her legs felt strange, like they belonged to someone else. The guests were between courses, the noise level in the room at its peak. Perfect. They wouldn't even notice when she started. She sat down at the bench and pulled out her composition. The pages were worn from being played so many times in her tiny apartment. Notes scribbled in the margins where she'd made changes and adjustments. She arranged them on the music stand with shaking hands. This was crazy. She should stick to the plan. Play the safe pieces. Collect her small paycheck and go home. Nobody wanted to hear the secret music of a middle-aged piano teacher who'd never made it. Those women were right. She was adequate, but uninspired. Elevator music. But then, she thought about going back to her apartment. Back to teaching children who didn't care. Back to a life that felt like it was shrinking a little more every day. She thought about being 70 years old and wondering what would have happened if she'd been brave enough to really play. Just once, instead of always holding back, her fingers found the keys. She took one more breath, deep and steady, and closed her eyes. The room buzzed with conversation and laughter and the clinking of expensive silverware on expensive plates. Nobody was paying attention to her. Nobody expected anything, which meant she had nothing to lose. She began to play. The opening notes were soft, almost hesitant, like the first words of a confession. This wasn't Chopin or Debussy or any of the dead composers whose music she'd been hiding behind. This was hers. Every note, every phrase, every moment of silence between the sounds. It was every dream she'd given up, every sacrifice she'd made. Every night she'd cried into her pillow, wondering if she'd made the right choices. The music started to build. Gaining strength and complexity, her fingers moved faster, more confident, finding patterns she'd practiced 1,000 times alone. And somewhere in the room behind her, though she couldn't see it with her eyes closed, someone stopped talking mid-sentence and turned to look at the piano. Then another person, and another. The music was demanding to be heard. The change in the room didn't happen all at once. It started small, like ripples spreading across water. A man near the front stopped mid-sentence, his fork halfway to his mouth. He tilted his head slightly as if trying to place a familiar melody he couldn't quite remember. But this wasn't a melody he'd heard before. Nobody had. His wife noticed him staring and turned to look at the piano too. The music continued to unfold, each phrase leading naturally into the next. This wasn't the polite, predictable music she'd been playing all evening. This was something different. Something that grabbed your attention and refused to let go. The melody line was complex, weaving in and out like a conversation between past and present. Between what was and what might have been, her fingers moved across the keys with a confidence she hadn't felt in years. Muscle memory from countless nights of practice took over, allowing her to stop thinking and just feel. The piece had taken her 3 years to write, and every measure contained something real. The opening section was about loss, but not the dramatic, overwhelming kind. The quiet kind. The kind that happens so slowly you don't notice until one day you wake up and realize you're living a completely different life than the one you'd imagined. More heads turned. A woman in a blue gown stood up from her table, drawn forward as if pulled by an invisible string. She moved closer to the piano, her champagne glass forgotten on the white tablecloth behind her. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the pianist's hands as they danced across the keys. The music shifted into the second movement, and the tempo increased. This section was faster, more urgent. If the first part was about loss, this part was about anger. Not the explosive kind, but the simmering frustration of years spent being overlooked, underestimated, invisible. The notes came quick and sharp, like words that had been held back too long finally being released. A server carrying a tray of appetizers stopped in his tracks, nearly dropping the expensive food. He stood frozen near the kitchen door, his mouth slightly open. He was young, maybe 20, the kind of face that suggested he'd seen plenty of fancy parties, but never quite felt part of them. Something in the music seemed to reach him, to speak directly to whatever dreams he was carrying while serving other people's meals. The conversations in the room were dying down, one table at a time. People who'd been deep in discussions about business deals and vacation homes found their words trailing off. They turned in their chairs to see where this extraordinary music was coming from. Some looked confused, as if they couldn't quite believe the same woman who'd been playing Forgettable. Background music for the past hour was now creating something that demanded their full attention. She kept her eyes closed, completely absorbed in the music. This was the part she'd rewritten at least 50 times, never quite satisfied with how it captured the feeling she was reaching for. It was the transition from anger to acceptance, from fighting against reality to finding peace with it. The notes softened, became more contemplative. The left hand played a steady, heartbeat-like rhythm, while the right hand explored a melody that seemed to ask questions without expecting answers. An older gentleman near the back stood up slowly, using his cane for support. His face was weathered, lined with the kind of wrinkles that come from a long life fully lived. He took a few careful steps toward the piano, and there were tears running down his cheeks. He made no move to wipe them away. A younger woman, probably his daughter, stood beside him with her hand on his arm. Her own eyes glistening. The ballroom staff had stopped working entirely. Waiters stood along the walls, their serving forgotten. The event coordinator, who'd been rushing around all evening, making sure everything ran smoothly, stood perfectly still near the entrance, her clipboard hanging loosely in her hand. Her lips were parted in surprise, and she kept shaking her head slightly, as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. The music built again, this time towards something that felt like hope. Not the naive, everything will be perfect kind of hope, but the harder one version. The kind that says, yes, life didn't turn out the way you planned. Yes, you lost things you can never get back. But you're still here, and there's still beauty to be found. The melody soared, reaching for the high notes that rang out clear and pure in the perfect acoustics of the ballroom. More people were standing now. They moved toward the piano from all directions, forming a loose semicircle around the platform. A woman in her 30s had both hands pressed to her chest, as if trying to hold something in. A man in an expensive suit had removed his glasses and was rubbing his eyes. Two teenage servers stood together near the bar, holding hands. Both transfixed by the music, she could feel the attention now, even with her eyes closed. The weight of it. The room had gone so quiet that every note rang out with crystal clarity. The only sounds were the piano and someone's quiet sobbing somewhere in the crowd. But she couldn't stop. Didn't want to stop. The piece was reaching its climax. The part where everything she'd been building toward came together. Her hands moved with impossible speed, playing passages she'd practiced until her fingers ached. The music was full and rich and complex, multiple melodies weaving together like threads in a tapestry. It contained everything she'd ever felt but couldn't say. The grief of watching her father struggle with illness. The guilt of feeling resentful about giving up her dreams, even though she knew it was the right thing to do. The loneliness of teaching music to children who would never love it the way she did. The quiet desperation of realizing year after year that this is all there was going to be. But it also contained the other things. The small moments of joy when a student finally understood something. The satisfaction of a perfectly played note. The comfort of her old piano in her small apartment. The strength it took to keep going, to keep finding reasons to get up every morning and do it all again. The courage of ordinary people living ordinary lives, which was its own kind of heroism, even if nobody ever recognized it. The music swelled to its peak, filling every corner of the massive ballroom. Her whole body moved with the force of it, swaying as her arms stretched across the full range of the keyboard. This was what music was supposed to be. Not background noise. Not elevator music. Not something adequate and uninspired. This was someone's entire soul transformed into sound, shared freely with anyone willing to listen, and they were listening. Every single person in that room was completely still, completely focused on the woman at the piano who'd been invisible to them just minutes ago. Some had tears streaming down their faces. Others wore expressions of pure wonder, like children seeing magic for the first time. A few looked almost angry, as if the music had reached inside them and pulled out feelings they'd been trying to keep buried. The piece began its descent toward the ending, the notes growing softer, but no less intense. This was the resolution, the final statement. It wasn't a happy ending exactly, but it was honest. It said, "This is who I am. This is what I've lived. This is the truth of a life that looks small from the outside but contained. Universes within it." Her fingers found the final chord and held it, letting it ring out until it faded into complete silence. She kept her eyes closed, her hands still resting on the keys, afraid that opening them would break whatever spell had been cast over the room. The silence lasted for what felt like forever. 3 seconds, maybe 4. In that suspended moment, she sat perfectly still at the piano, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. Her hands were still trembling on the keys. She'd just exposed the most vulnerable parts of herself to a room full of strangers. And now she had to face whatever came next. Then it started. A single person began clapping, and the sound echoed through the ballroom like a gunshot. Then another joined in, and another. Within seconds, the entire room erupted into applause, so thunderous it seemed to shake the crystal chandeliers overhead. She opened her eyes slowly, almost afraid of what she'd see. People were on their feet. Every single person in that massive ballroom was standing, clapping, some with their hands raised high above their heads. The noise was deafening. She'd never heard anything like it, not even in her younger days, when she'd won competitions. This was different. This was raw and real and overwhelming. A woman near the front was crying openly, not even trying to hide it. Her mascara ran in black streaks down her cheeks, but she didn't seem to care. She clapped so hard her hands must have hurt. Next to her, a man who looked like he'd never shown emotion in his entire life had his hand pressed over his mouth. His eyes squeezed shut, his shoulders shaking. The older gentleman with the cane was wiping his face with a handkerchief, nodding his head over and over like he was agreeing with something only he could hear. His daughter had her arm around him, and she was crying too, but smiling at the same time. They both kept clapping, even as tears fell. Someone shouted, "Bravo." From the back of the room, Then others picked it up. Bravo, bravo. The word echoed from different corners, mixing with the applause to create a wall of sound that felt almost physical. She stood up from the piano bench on shaky legs, sure of what to do. Should she bow? Wave. She'd never been good at accepting praise. For most of her life, there hadn't been much to accept. She gave a small, awkward nod, which only made people clap harder. Then a man pushed through the crowd toward her. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with wild gray hair and an expensive suit that somehow looked rumpled despite probably costing thousands of dollars. His eyes were red, and he moved with purpose, like a man on a mission. People stepped aside to let him through. He reached the platform and looked up at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Shock, maybe. Or disbelief. His voice shook when he spoke. "Who are you?" he asked, loud enough to be heard over the continuing applause. "Who trained you? Where have you been playing?" She stared at him, confused. I teach piano. At a small music school downtown." His eyes widened even more. "You teach children's lessons?" He said it like she'd just told him she was an astronaut or a brain surgeon. "That piece. Who wrote it?" "I did," she said quietly, though she wasn't sure he heard her over the noise. "You wrote that?" He looked like she'd just told him the sky was green. That's extraordinary. That's beyond extraordinary." He pulled a card from his pocket with shaking hands and thrust it at her. "I'm a conductor. I've worked with every major orchestra on the East Coast. That piece you just played is better than half the compositions I've seen in the last decade. Better than most, actually." She took the card, but couldn't process what it said. The words swam in front of her eyes. More people were pressing forward now, all trying to reach her at once. A woman in a designer dress grabbed her hand and squeezed it hard. "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard," the woman said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't even know how to explain what it made me feel. It was like you reached inside my chest and played my own heart." A younger woman pushed through, maybe 25, wearing a server's uniform with a name tag. Her eyes were bright with tears. "I'm a music student," she said quickly, like she didn't have much time. "I'm studying piano at the university. I work these events to pay tuition. I've been to 100 concerts, heard hundreds of pieces, but nothing has ever moved me like what you just played." The event organizer appeared, her face flushed with excitement. She was talking rapidly into her phone, gesturing wildly with her free hand. When she reached the piano, she ended the call and grabbed the pianist's arm. "I just canceled the rest of tonight's program," she said breathlessly. "Everyone wants to hear more. Will you play again, please? We'll pay you triple. No, 5 times what we agreed. Just please, play something else." Before she could answer, someone else was pushing forward. A man in his 40s with slicked back hair and an aggressive handshake. "I'm an agent," he announced, like this explained everything. "I represent musicians. Get them recording contracts, concert bookings. I have contacts at every major venue in the country. Here's my card. Call me tomorrow. First thing, we need to talk." Her head was spinning. Nothing made sense. 10 minutes ago, she'd been invisible. Background noise, elevator music. Now people were pressing business cards into her hands, talking about contracts and concerts and recordings. The conductor was still standing there, shaking his head in amazement. "How long have you been writing music?" he asked. "Since I was 16, she managed to say. "And you've never performed your own work? Never tried to get it published or recorded?" She shook her head. "I didn't think anyone would want to hear it." "I'm just a teacher," he laughed, but it wasn't mean. It was the kind of laugh that comes from disbelief. "Just a teacher. Do you understand what you have? The gift you've been hiding?" He turned to address the crowd around them. "This woman is a genius. An actual genius. And she's been teaching basic piano lessons in some strip mall somewhere, while the rest of us have been searching everywhere for new talent." The crowd had grown larger. More people kept joining, all wanting to tell her how the music had affected them. A businessman in a tuxedo explained how it reminded him of his mother, who'd passed away last year. A young couple said they'd been fighting before the music started, but now they were holding hands and couldn't remember what the argument was about. An elderly woman claimed she hadn't cried in 30 years, not since her husband died. But the music had broken something open inside her. Someone had pulled out their phone during the performance and recorded it. They held it up now, showing her the video. Even in the small screen, you could see the power of what had happened. The way people's faces changed as the music progressed. The way the entire atmosphere of the room transformed from polite socializing to something deeper, something real. "This is going viral," the person with the phone said excitedly. "I already posted it, and it's got 5,000 views. People are sharing it everywhere." She looked at the screen, at the woman sitting at the piano, and for a moment she couldn't recognize herself. That woman looked confident, powerful, completely absorbed in her art. That woman looked like everything she'd once hoped to become. The conductor was talking again, at it, making plans, discussing possibilities. Other people were chiming in with ideas, connections, opportunities. The noise and excitement swirled around her like a storm, and she stood in the center of it, still trying to understand what had just happened. All she'd done was play honest. All she'd done was stop hiding and let them hear who she really was. And somehow, impossibly, that had been enough. The days that followed felt like living in someone else's life. She kept expecting to wake up and find it had all been a dream. That she was still just the piano teacher in the small apartment with its scratched-up upright piano and students who didn't really want to be there. But it wasn't a dream. The phone calls started the next morning. The conductor called first at 7:30, apologizing for calling so early, but saying he couldn't wait. He wanted to discuss performing her composition with his orchestra. An actual orchestra. She sat on her bed in her pajamas, listening to him talk about rehearsal schedules and concert halls, wondering if this was really happening. Then the agent called. Then a journalist from a classical music magazine. Then someone from a radio station. Her voicemail filled up. Her email inbox exploded. The video from the gala had spread across the internet like wildfire, shared and reshared thousands of times. By the second day, it had over 3 million views. People she'd never met were commenting, arguing about music theory, asking who she was and where they could hear more. A recording label reached out with a contract. They wanted to produce an album of her original compositions. The advance they offered was more money than she'd made in the past 5 years combined. She read the number 3 times, convinced there was a mistake, an extra zero that shouldn't be there. The most surreal moment came when she received an email from one of the most prestigious concert halls in the world. They had an opening in their schedule in 6 months. Would she be interested in a debut performance? She stared at the email for 20 minutes before her hands stopped shaking enough to type a response. Her students' parents started treating her differently. One mother who'd always been slightly dismissive, who'd complained about the cost of lessons and questioned her teaching methods, suddenly couldn't stop bragging that her daughter was taught by the piano sensation. Everyone's talking about. The mother brought flowers to the next lesson and asked for a selfie. The music school where she taught offered her a raise and a promotion. The director, who'd barely spoken to her in 15 years beyond basic scheduling discussions, suddenly wanted to feature her in their marketing materials. Our renowned composer and performer, the new brochure would say. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry, but the strangest part, the part that took the longest to process, wasn't the external changes. It was what had shifted inside her. She'd spent so long thinking of herself as someone who'd failed, who'd given up on her dreams and settled for less. The woman who taught children's piano lessons instead of performing on stages. The woman who'd let life shrink her down to fit into a smaller and smaller space. That night at the gala, something had broken open. Or maybe it had always been there, waiting, and she'd finally been brave enough to let it out. She'd stopped apologizing for taking up space, stopped playing small, stopped hiding behind other people's music and other people's expectations of what her life should be. 3 weeks after the gala, she sat at her old upright piano in her small apartment. The same piano that had seemed so inadequate compared to the grand piano at the country club, the same cramped space that had felt like a prison sometimes. But now, as she played through a new composition she'd started writing, the apartment felt different. The piano sounded different. Or maybe she was different, her neighbor upstairs. The one who used to bang on the floor when she practiced late at night knocked on her door one evening. She braced herself for another complaint. Instead, he stood in the hallway, looking uncomfortable, holding a bottle of wine. "I saw the video," he said. "The one from that fancy party?" I had no idea. All this time, I've been listening to someone that talented through my floor and treating it like noise. He handed her the wine. "I'm sorry. Play as late as you want, please." She invited him in for coffee, and they talked for 2 hours. He was an accountant who'd once wanted to be a writer, but gave it up because it seemed impractical. They traded stories about dreams deferred, about the weight of choosing security over passion. When he left, they both had tears in their eyes. But they were smiling too. The young music student who'd approached her at the gala, the one working as a server to pay tuition, reached out through email. Could they meet for coffee? She wanted advice about pursuing music professionally. They met at a small cafe, and the girl poured out her fears about whether she was good enough. Whether it was worth the struggle, whether she should just give up and find something more stable. "I almost gave up that night," she told the girl honestly. "I almost walked out of that ballroom thinking I was exactly what those women said I was. Adequate but uninspired. Just someone going through the motions." "What changed?" the girl asked. She thought about it for a long moment. "I realized I was tired of playing it safe, tired of being invisible. I'd spent 20 years protecting myself from failure by never really trying. And you know what's funny? All that protection, all that playing it safe, it felt like failure anyway. At least if I was going to fail, I wanted to fail while being myself." The girl nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. The biggest opportunity came 2 months after the gala. The recording label wanted to start working on the album, but they had a request. They wanted her to perform one concert before the recording sessions, something intimate, to work out the arrangements and see how the pieces felt with a live audience. They'd booked a small theater, only 300 seats, the night of that concert. She stood backstage in a simple black dress, much nicer than the one she'd worn to the gala, but still nothing fancy. Her hands were shaking. The old fears tried to creep back in. What if the gala had been a fluke? What if she couldn't do it again? What if everyone realized she was just a piano teacher who'd gotten lucky one night? She walked onto the stage, and the applause was warm and welcoming. The spotlight was bright in her eyes, but she could see the silhouettes of people in their seats, waiting. The piano was another beautiful, grand, well-tuned and ready. She sat down, took a breath, and placed her hands on the keys, and then she played. Not for the audience, not for the recording label, not for the critics who might review the concert later. She played for herself. For the 16-year-old girl who dreamed of stages like this. For the 20-year-old who'd given up those dreams to take care of her father. For the 35-year-old who'd felt like life was passing her by. For every version of herself that had carried music inside but kept it locked away. The piece she played was new, written just for this moment. It was about transformation. About how it's never too late to become who you were meant to be. About how the things we think are endings are sometimes just beginnings we haven't recognized yet. When she finished and the applause washed over her, she finally understood something that had taken her 42 years to learn. The dream she'd given up all those years ago. The one she'd mourned and grieved and thought was lost forever. It had never really gone away. It had just been waiting for her to be ready for it. Waiting for her to be brave enough to claim it. She wasn't background music anymore. She never had been. She'd just forgotten how to play her own song. But now she remembered, and the whole world was listening.